Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. It's a privilege to be here the first time as in a different seat, but we're still Bobby D, and we're all here together to work here together and do some good things together. And I want to welcome Sabrina Wooten, who was just sworn in the Centerville seat. So if we can welcome Sabrina, please. You know, it's very important, the work that we do here. And one of the things that I'm going to suggest going forward is that perhaps we meet a little bit more frequently, both formally and informally, to work things out, maybe a joint, retreat sometime, because we have a lot of things in common. And communication is always a good thing, and maybe we can even get members of our delegation to come in from time to time, just to enhance the communication. Just so, we have challenges ahead of us. Let's not kid each other, financial and otherwise. But like I said, if we come together a consensus and unified in the right direction, I think it'll benefit everybody. So if we can perhaps, have that discussion about more collaboration, I think that would be great. Okay, I think we're ready to go with the presentations at this point. So, Greg Gutenhurst.
Mr. Mayor, if I may?
Yes, sir.
The order of march is shown on the screens both in front of you, and we have two screens showing behind you so that those in attendance can see this as well. We are not live streaming because we don't have that ability from this facility, but we will have our VBT TV team get this thing wrapped up, processed, and online as soon as possible following this presentation. Greg Grutendorst is the Chief Economist for the Hampton Roads Planning Commission. Greg joined us last year for the first time. He sets the conditions looking at both the national and the regional perspective with regards to economic projections. And then he'll be followed by the CFO of schools. Farrell Hansaker will come forward, and then we'll have David Bradley wrap it up, the Director of Budget and Management Services for the City of Virginia Beach.
Yeah, welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of City Council, School Board, Dr. Spence, Mr. Hanson. It's always a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to taking you through a bunch of slides today. I would really encourage you to interrupt me at any point. If you have any questions, please do so. There are a bunch of slides, and it makes it more interesting when I get to answer the questions that you have. So I was asked to talk a little bit about the Hampton Roads economy, the regional economy, to put things a little bit in perspective. And one of the things that helps to put the regional economy in perspective is the national economy. Traditionally, Hampton Roads used to follow the national economy pretty closely. What happened at the nation also happened in Hampton Roads, so it was pretty easy to kind of figure out what things looked like for us. We just could look to the nation. And when we look to the nation right now, to put things in a little bit of perspective, going back to the beginning, the onset of the Great Recession in 2007, you can see that nationally things are looking pretty good. Gross domestic product is up 24% from the recession low. You can see that there's been a consistent trend towards recovery and then economic growth there that going all the way back the end of 2009. If we look at non-farm civilian employment, this is a payroll employment, the headline numbers that you typically see coming out every month. We've seen 1.7% growth since the recession low. Again, a very sustained, consistent trend. One of the things that you'd like to forecast because that line's trending so steadily. The unemployment rate, the rate in and of itself is typically a rather useless number, but the trend, the unemployment trend, and the components that you use to calculate the unemployment rate are important. And if we look at the trend here, we can see that we had a pre-recession or a recession high of 10% in unemployment. Today we're down at around 3.7%, which many would consider full employment. You don't want to dip much lower than that. One of the things that is good about such a low unemployment rate is it should put upward pressure on wages. But essentially, we're at where probably we don't want to dip any lower than that. And even if we creep up a little bit with respect to the unemployment rate, it's not such a bad thing.
Move back that slide just once. know there are several definitions of unemployment. When I went and looked at some other forecasts trying to explain why unemployment being low isn't driving up wages, they talk to some inherently differentiation of people working 2 or 3 jobs or being counted as employed, but they're still underemployed. And it's the mismatch between the labor market demands and the skills of the workers, which is including price pressure. But can you comment on the different perspectives about the interworkings of unemployment and the different ways that that's looked at?
Absolutely. So essentially, when we say unemployment rate, we're talking about what the Bureau of Labor Statistics calls U3. There's 6 levels of unemployment, U1, U2, it goes all the way through U6, and U6 is a much more inclusive component of determining who is unemployed. For example, if you are in a job, but your skill level is somewhere over here, and you're working in a job that's over here, and there's a clear mismatch, you can't find the job you want, that would be included in unemployment rate. If you're working part-time, but you want to be full-time, then you would be included as underemployed. So the different categories of what is considered to be employed and unemployed vary according to the U1 through U6 ranking. One of the interesting things about the different rankings is if you graph them all, and this is why I'm saying the rate itself is kind of useless, but the trend is important. If you graph all the different 6 rates, they all follow the same trend line. So that's why, when I present this, I say the trend is what's important here. There are a lot of people that are still underemployed. The rate could come down. You could see fuller employment with respect to people having a better skills match with the jobs that are available, or people that are more suited to the employment they're looking for. But that's typical in any employment cycle. That's typically in any economic cycle that you would have somewhat of these mismatches. One of the things that you start looking to when unemployment rates are this low is the number of people who quit jobs. So if the quit rate increases, that typically is a pretty good indicator that the economy is in a healthy spot, because when unemployment rates were at 10%, you didn't see a whole lot of people quitting, right? It's hard to find a new job. If it's easy to find a new job, then for the labor force, for the laborers, a high quit percentage, if I can take my job and go somewhere else and get something better, it's better for the labor force. People in the industry don't like it so much because it increases their expenses and drives up their costs. So, Mr. Moss, I hope that answers your question. Yes. If we look at the stock market, we've seen a little bit of a skid in the last couple of months here, and even today, but essentially, we're up about 270% from where we were compared to the pre-recession low. 76% from the pre-recession high. So there's going to be fluctuations in the stock market, and you've seen some of those fluctuations. Well, I'm certainly not going to tell you what it's going to look like tomorrow. Otherwise, I would be one of those people who would be quitting their job and doing, if I was at all successful in predicting the stock market. However, we do recognize that there's going to be fluctuations, but essentially the stock market has been relatively healthy. We could see some corrections and continued corrections in the near term that still puts the U.S. economy in pretty healthy state. So if we compare the U.S. to Hampton Roads, what are we looking at? If you look at the black line here, this is essentially that payroll employment, that headline number that comes out. And where the line starts is where we went into recession. So where the black line starts is where the U.S. went into recession, and that was all the way back in 2007, beginning of 2007. The orange line is Virginia, and the green line is Hampton Roads. One of the things you'll notice is the green line is longer. The reason the green line is longer is because Hampton Roads actually entered into recession before the U.S. or the Commonwealth did. We actually dipped down the month the Ford plant closed. If you all remember that, way back in July of 2006. So that's when we dipped down, and it's taken us a long time to recover our jobs. Both the Commonwealth and the nation recovered their jobs in 2014. 2014 is when they recovered their jobs. It took us an additional 4 years to recover the civilian jobs that were lost as part of the Great Recession. And we recovered them in April of this year. But those were just the civilian jobs. Now, if you were to include the military personnel, uniformed personnel that we've lost, we're still not at our pre-recession high. So Hampton Roads, as you can see here, has had a really long and difficult struggle to come back from what hurt us with this long Great Recession. It took us a little while to get into the depth of it, and I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but it has been a long slugfest to work our way out of it.
What relationship, because in the annual report that just came out of Old Dominion, talked about how the private sector salaries were 2.5 times lower than the federal sector, and the public sector salaries, that's one of the little graphs in the report, you may recall it. Is there some correlation between the low salary gains, or certainly the salary gains were much lower, and real terms are less than they were before the recession, and that maybe U6 in terms of the mismatch between the skills people have and the employment that's available?
Some of the employment that has come back into the region, the jobs that people have transitioned into have been lower paying than the jobs that they left prior to the recession. So if you look at the income component along with the employment component, there is certainly that. The federal sector, the Old Dominion numbers, the reason it looks 2.5 times higher, you know, if you ask somebody who works for the military, you say, hey, your income's 2.5 times as high as mine, they'll tell you, no, it's not. And when they show you your paycheck, you'll see that it's not. It's once you include all the benefits. So the whole benefits package and everything that comes along with the people in the DoD, that's why the numbers showed so much significantly higher than in the private sector. And there's a couple of underlying currents there that are important to understand as well. For example, a lot of the part-time jobs that are included in the private sector don't pay benefits, and that's why the wages look so lower. I think that's kind of important to understand. But essentially, the federal sector does pay significantly more than the private sector in Hampton Roads. And this was exacerbated in a number of ways in this chart. One was that when the private sector started laying off, like those jobs at Ford, where we lost pretty significant jobs, the federal sector was still, the federal government was still pumping out contracts, military contracts, which paid really well. So there was essentially a divergence that happened between the federal sector and the private sector there. Since that time, it has narrowed a little bit, and we're starting to see some increased wages in the private sector here. But those numbers typically have a pretty significant lag, sometimes an 18-month lag before we can tell you what actually happened. So if we look at Hampton Roads gross product here, one of the things that you'll see, this is real, this is inflation adjusted. When I say real, I mean it accounts for inflation. But essentially, I told you here that we've had this long struggle to get back to where we were in 2007. When you look at the gross product, we include defense in that, we're actually 2.1% below where we were in 2007. So if you can imagine that, all this, the work that the region has done to fight back from the Great Recession, I mean, essentially we've been swimming against an outflow of federal dollars here, means that in terms of the gross product, we're still not at where we were back 2007. And if you compare us to other metropolitan areas, I hope you can see this. I apologize if you can't. But on the left hand there, you have San Jose, Austin, San Antonio, Nashville. You have some metro regions that are growing gangbusters and have done really, really well. On the lower end here, you have Milwaukee, Rochester, Tucson. Hampton Roads is 6th from the bottom. So this is just looking at over the past 3 years that we have data for and comparing us to other metropolitan areas between 1 and 4 million. How does Hampton Roads compare? Well, we don't compare that favorably. We've had a difficult go of things. If we go back and we look at these non-farm civilian jobs in Hampton Roads, you can see that this trend that we have has recovered a little more than the 50,000 jobs that we lost during that Great Recession. But it's been, you know, a couple of fits and starts, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, so to speak, as we've recovered that. This experience, of course, hasn't been the same across industries. So not everybody felt this same trend through their industry. And if we look at that, some of the industries, if we go back looking at a decade ago, healthcare, for example, federal government, the scientific technical industry, leisure and hospitality have seen significant employment growth over the past decade. We're on the lower end, local government, construction, information, wholesale trade. Those industries have been hit significantly hard. And so again, the experience by industry differs substantially over the past decade. And if we change it and we just look over the past year, I should have made a point about this early on, Mr. Bradley, apology. Some of the slides that are on screen are not in front of you. So if you're trying to follow, I've added a few slides and some of the data has been updated. So I'd encourage you to look at the screen rather than what's in front of you because it might change just a little bit. But going back to this is over the past year. We can see what's happened over the past year. Manufacturing has taken a significant gain over the past year, which is encouraging. Again, the scientific, technical industry, administrative and support, and again, tourism. On the bottom end, we've lost some healthcare employment, which is not necessarily a bad thing. We've seen substantial gains in there well over a 10-year period. So there's been a little bit of cool in there. Local government continues to be shedding jobs, education services, real estate, and leasing.
I have a question on that slide. It's interesting that information technology is not a category. So is that skill set embedded within each of those categories? And is there a scheme that allows you to understand within each of those sectors what the information technology percentage of jobs are in those categories?
Yeah, to get at that, I'm sure you've heard of the National Industrial Classification System, right? It can be very difficult to understand. And in some components, like if you look in here, you have scientific, technical, some of the information technology will be held in there. There is an information component, 6 up from the bottom. Some of the information technologies are held in there. But let me just give you an example. This is the best that the government is able to do in terms of categorizing these things, and it can be difficult. For example, real quickly, if Walmart has security personnel that are working for Walmart, and say they have, in Hampton Roads, they have 500 of these security personnel working at Walmart through Hampton Roads, those 500 security personnel are classified as retail, right? If Walmart lays off those 500 and subcontracts with the security agency that now is providing 500 security offers to work at Walmart, they have now transferred from retail into a different industry classification. So the way they classify these industries, there's a big blue book, it's that thick, and you can go down and you can fine line these things, but the reality is it comes up to the individual company organization as to how they report it.
Okay, thank you. Self-reporting.
If we look at per capita income, this is one of the measures of well-being that I think is very important. Employment tells us one side of the story, incomes tell us a different side of the story. If we look at this black bar here, anytime these gray bars are above the black bar, that means that our relative per capita income in Hampton Roads is higher than the national average, and where we are under the black bar, we're below the national average. The gray bar compares Hampton Roads to the Commonwealth, so anytime that we're not nowhere close to the Commonwealth. But if we compare ourselves to the nation, you can see back in the 80s, we were at 105% of the nation's per capita income. Then in 2000, we dropped to 92% of per capita income. And lately, we've been on a bit of a skid ever since 2009. We're currently, our per capita income is at 96%. So this is one of the things, when we're looking at employment, that's one side of the story, the income's the other. So if we're gaining employment, but the jobs are not paying well, it's reflected in our incomes here.
Well, in part, yes, but everyone recognizes that per capita income is not an indication of household well-being because it includes interest income, rents from investments, which most of the population doesn't have. So it takes a lot of income streams that are non-wage that go into to produce that number. And from a policymaker point of view, it talks to a lot of income streams that we can't tax as a
Very
local
true.
government. And so therefore, while it might give you an indication of the wealth of the economy, it doesn't give you an indication of income streams that you can reach by fiscal policy. And so median family income is much more representative of your ability to go out and raise resources in the implication than per capita income is for local government. I think you would agree.
You're exactly right, and here you go. Here's your median family income. This is much more representative of well-being. So if I had to pick, would I rather have a higher per capita income or a higher median family income? I would choose the higher median family income because it is much more representative of not only the well-being, but also the ability of people to pay, the ability of people to collect revenue from. And in this sense here, Hampton Roads does better certainly than the per capita income. You know, if you have real high income earners, they can skew per capita income as well. Yeah, that's not the case for median family income. So here's one of the areas where Hampton Roads compares rather favorably. And there's a number of reasons for this. Certainly, the occupational and industrial mix that we have in Hampton Roads lends itself to that. We also have a very low Gini coefficient, which is a disparity of incomes between the have and the have-nots. If you have a low Gini coefficient, other quality of life measures such as median family income tend to be better. So that does paint Hampton Roads in a more positive light. Switching gears a little bit.
I'm sorry, can we go back to that? I had a question. I didn't see it in the full report, but is this data ever broken up into like like age? What's the word I'm looking for?
Age
And
cohorts?
Thank you. And age demographics. You see where newer families, the people that are just now starting to settle down versus the seniors, where they're seeing. I just would be interesting to see how this plays out with small new families versus the retired population and where they're going with their income and how that's impacting.
Yeah, so at the federal level, that information is certainly available through the census. You can get some of it at the state level, but we don't have it at the regional level or at the sub-regional level, jurisdiction level. But you know, a lot of those statistics play out as you might expect. You know, the older generations have a lot more wealth than they do income.
Well, but I wonder if that's starting to change, because I know that I see on a day-to-day that we're seeing older people it seems like their income is becoming more and more restrictive, at least maybe on the middle class side, and then you have new families, and particularly younger people, that can't seem to get over the $70,000 a year family mark, and in our area, particularly Virginia Beach, that puts you under financial strain to live here. So that's why I was asking about it. I'm just curious if you said the federal level has that.
Yeah, the federal, and a very interesting component to go along with that is the trend analysis that's associated with that, because if you look at the static data, it doesn't really tell you anything, but what you're talking about is evident in the trend data, where you do see substantial changes, and if you look to the baby boomers and the retirement of the baby boomers and the way we have some of the programs set up, some of these things are going to get much worse before they get any better. So.
Thank you.
Switching gears again, this is at the national level, annualized real defense outlays. This is what the federal government is spending money on, and this takes us all the way back to just post-World War II. But you can get a sense that this data, which is inflation adjusted, is cyclical. We see substantial gains and we see declines, gains and declines. And you can go back to the Vietnam War and you can see that there was a huge buildup to the Vietnam War. And again, with the 80s Cold War buildup, outlays went way up, and the war on terror as well. If we look at military personnel, both in Hampton Roads and the U.S., the U.S. is the black line and Hampton Roads is the green bars. One of the things that you'll see that's kind of interesting, the data doesn't quite line up. We're coming just out of the Vietnam War. You can see that as defense outlays declined after Vietnam, so did military personnel. As the Cold War buildup happened in the 80s, you could see employment rose in the 80s. But what you don't see is you see the huge run-up in defense outlays in the war on terror, and that's not reflected here in the employment component of the military personnel. We saw a slight bump, but certainly we didn't see the big bumps that were associated with defense outlays before. And that's because the Department of Defense doesn't, as outlays increased at the Department of Defense, they switched from military personnel to contracting. And you can see that here in Hampton Roads. Defense contracting in Hampton Roads ran up substantially. Again, these are inflation-adjusted dollars, so you can compare 2011 to 1995 year to year. And one of the things that's really interesting here is a substantial increase that we saw in defense contracts for a long time offset the declines that we saw in military personnel. So as military personnel were leaving or were being cut from the region, we lost 25,000 going back in the past decade. We saw a significant increase in defense contracts, which was great because somebody came out of the DOD, they went in the private sector and the federal government paid for them and we had jobs here. But what happened in 2011 with the sequestration is suddenly we saw a halt to federal expenditures. And suddenly, we see a decrease in defense contracts coupled with the declining military personnel. And now the cuts in contracts exacerbated what we saw with military personnel. And that is the reason that Hampton Roads has had such a difficult time recovering from the Great Recession, because we've just seen this outflow of federal dollars, both in terms of military personnel, but also military contracts, that the private sector has been trying to swim upstream to try and catch up to it. So that's what's happened in Hampton Roads, and in 2016, we saw a slight bump. 2017, we saw another slight bump. 2018 has been a fantastic year for us, and 2019 should be as well. Real quickly on the ports, general cargo in Hampton Roads, this is typically what people look at when they're talking about the ports, how much cargo is going through. They want to know how much traffic's going through. Some of this is really important. Other components aren't. But one of the interesting things here is if I overlaid a line on this that showed international trade, it would track pretty close to it. So as international trade increases, so does cargo through the ports. Does that matter to you? Well, containers are up, and people like to point to the container traffic increasing at the ports. That's a good thing in terms of the port being competitive. If our competitor ports see container traffic's going up and ours are declining, then that could say something that's not too good about our ports. But if we look at the number of ships is in decline. The reason containers are up and ships are in decline is because the ships are huge. Massive ships coming through. I hope you get to see them every once in a while. It's really incredible. In terms of our share of ports on the East Coast, we're being relatively consistent. So we're seeing container traffic increase. So is Savannah, so is New York, so is Charleston. So the port's doing really well. One of the things is, as port traffic changes, if the containers go up or the containers go down, it does not really impact employment in Hampton Roads. It doesn't impact port employment in Hampton Roads. So the number of containers coming through has a very, very small effect on the employment, port-related employment in Hampton Roads, because a lot of that employment is static. You're going to have logistics people in Hampton Roads regardless if containers go up and down. You're going to have maritime law here regardless of how that changes. A lot of the manufacturing that is port-related here is going to be consistent and is not going to be influenced by the amount of container traffic. So I wouldn't want you to think, wow, that line's going up, port-related employment must be fantastic, or it's declining, we're in trouble. A lot of the port-related employment is related to different economic factors, not just the containers that are going through.
So on that note, in today's paper, there was an article about our ports have increased significantly in the last couple months. And they attribute it to the fact that, you know, people are trying to get their products into the ports before the tariffs go up in January. So the paper indicated that that might have, I mean, it didn't really say, but it kind of alluded to the fact that that may have some bearing on employment in the area. And you're saying that really won't have much effect to it.
So in terms of the share of port-related employment in Hampton Roads, it has a very negligible effect. And the reason for this is so many of the things that are related to the movement of containers are automated or require very little employment. Truck traffic requires a lot of employment, so you will see an increase in truck drivers and increase in the number of hours that they're using there. But if any of you all have ever been to the port is an amazing place. I hope you all get the opportunity to go visit someday. It's incredible what they can do and how efficient they are and how competitive they are with other ports. But as more containers come on, you don't see a huge rise in employment to deal with the containers. The people that are there and the machinery that is in place takes these containers and moves them very efficiently. So that increase in containers doesn't mean that there's a lot more port people working. It just means probably we have more truck drivers and some of the distribution centers.
This is what I do all day long. So, but this is, he's absolutely correct. But what part of the ultra-large container vessels, they unload more at a time, or they're just to get the larger vessel in, so the capacity needed to be larger. So they're still moving. The boxes that they're moving, the containers they're moving just needed more space because they're taking off. They have the ability to take more on and off at the same time. So in regard to employment, he's right. You've got logistics folks. We need to think bigger than just even Hampton Roads. We need to think statewide when it comes to this, and I'll try not to go too much further, but I'm actually thrilled for the first time ever in this 5-year forecast that we're talking about Hampton Roads, and you're giving this. So just thank you and keep going, but it's really exciting. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a nerd when it comes to the port.
No, appreciate it. You know, nerds are fantastic because I learn a lot from them. If
We do need to think about the jobs that we're training people for, very specifically. That is, to the point and where I'm feeling passionate about, and this is we need folks, they don't need to go to college, guys. We can do on-the-job training. Any of your folks doing logistics, the importer, exporters, custom broker, freight forwarders, they can do all the the job training that after we give them a great foundation, K through 12, they can actually go ahead and go to work straight ahead. And to your point, you know, we've got great logistics folks. So.
Yeah. And many of the people that do port-related work, occupations that are port-related, are not what you would traditionally think of people walking onto the port and moving containers. The jobs that are associated, a lot of them are, you know, mathematics skills, computer software engineers, those type of skills. If we slide over to tourism real quick, this again is inflation-adjusted data, so you can compare year to year. We can look at 2007. We saw the high right before the Great Recession. We've actually seen 13.2% increase since then. Tourism in Hampton Roads is a mature industry. It's one of those industries that is incredibly important. It's one of the foundational industries in Hampton Roads. But it's not like suddenly Disney World's going to locate here and change up the whole game in terms of tourism. This region from Williamsburg, the historic triangle, all the way through Norfolk, Chesapeake, into Virginia Beach, there's a whole host of tourism-related jobs, and the region depends on it. I wish we'd do a better job of marketing it all together, but it's a very mature industry. We don't see a whole lot of change here. So when we see growth here, it's important to us. It's definitely one of those things we don't want to see losses. If we look at tourism across Hampton Roads, the experience from Williamsburg to all the way up through York County, James City County, into Virginia Beach, the experience by locality and even sub-market is very different. So this is not consistent across, you know, the number of people that are visiting Jamestown has not kept up with the number of people that are visiting the beach, for example. So as things change, there has been some growth in some areas and decline in others. But if we look across the region, we've seen a 13.2% increase in expenditures, which is what we're after. Unless you own a hotel and you're seeing that we're down 2.9% over the past decade. So how is it that tourism expenditures are increasing and hotels are down and employment, tourism-related employment's up? Well, you have the sharing industry. So the Airbnbs and the VRBOs, people are coming in and they're still visiting this area. They're just doing it in somewhat of a different way. I actually have a friend who has, he does Airbnb and he owns one in Norfolk. And for him, he makes a good deal of money on this. And one of the things he says is almost, I guess, 90% of the people who go to his Airbnb are actually trying to get to Virginia Beach. And they can't find a place in Virginia Beach. So they go to his place in Norfolk. And when they get there, he has a whole list of things to do in Hampton Roads that goes all the way up to the peninsula and the beach, as well as things to do in Norfolk. But he markets the region from his Airbnb because that's what people want. They're not looking necessarily for a locality. So the sharing industry has had an impact on hotel revenues, but tourism expenditures, again, are going up. So this is positive news for Hampton Roads.
I have a question about that slide. As far as the 2.9%, is that a high number, a low number compared to other markets that have, I mean, obviously, the home sharing and short-term rentals are everywhere now. I mean, in comparable markets to us, is that high or low? I actually would have thought they had more of a market.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't have the data to compare this with. What would be interesting is to look at it nationally. That would be a really interesting perspective. And, if I can find data to do that, I'll get back to you. But some of the data we have is just for localities, which makes some of those comparisons a little more difficult. Certainly an interesting thing. We do know that there has been some decline over the past decade in terms of what hotels nationally have expected versus what. but I don't know the nuances of that data, but I'll look into that.
Appreciate it.
I'd like to see it with comparable localities, i.e. like Myrtle Beach, Ocean City, those type of places.
Yes.
I'd like to see a comparison to the, to their market.
So essentially, the data where we get this is Smith Travel Research, and you pay per market. But, I might be able to work with Virginia Beach staff, who I think has access to some of the national data on this that we don't, and look into that. But I can talk to Mr. Hanson about that after. Going over to retail sales now, one of the things, you're getting kind of bored of this now, where you're saying, hey, yeah, we declined and we slowly came back up and everything's great. We're up 11.8% from where we were at the recession, pre-recession high. One of the things that's kind of interesting with the retail sales in Hampton Roads is we've seen an annualized growth rate of 1.2% since 2006, and you might think that that's all right, that's pre-recession, but the reality is, once you adjust for inflation, we're seeing a negative 1.1% decline on an annual basis. And one of the reasons that this is really important to localities is because localities and education as well derives a great deal of their revenue from retail sales. And so if you have your wagon hitched to a horse that's showing a 1.1% decline year over year, once you've adjusted for inflation, this starts to create a problem. And when we look at retail sales moving forward, you'll have to forgive a couple anomalies that we're going to have in a couple of months here. You might see it in the headline, retail sales is booming. That's just a state fluctuation. But the reality is, long-term, we do not expect retail sales to increase substantially. They'll probably continue along this trend. And one of the things is expenditure patterns are changing significantly. And so what people choose to spend money on and how much they spend on it has shifted over time. And what we tax has been kind of the same thing we've taxed for the last long time, and that basket hasn't changed. So when you go to the store and you buy a diaper, you pay tax on it. But when you go to the hair salon and get your hair done and spend $200 there, you pay no tax. A lot of the service sector where people are switching from goods to services, they don't pay taxes on services. A study was done about 3 years ago that said if you wanted to remain revenue neutral and you took the retail sales tax and you applied it to services in Virginia, you could reduce the sales tax from 5% state level to 1% and remain revenue neutral by just applying the tax to services. Now, there's a lot of dynamics that are important to understand, but the reality is if we have our wagon hitched to this horse, and what's one of the main drivers for revenues for our localities, we need to be very concerned about where this is going in the future.
Well, there's also been analysis in different journals and Wall Street Journal about also because labor is getting a smaller percentage of GDP than historically has received. It's down to 62%, and that little every 1% is a big amount of money. And also the distribution of that income stream has shifted way to the right on the curve. And so the median family income, discretionary income, is phenomenally shrunk. And the people upper income only spend so much, then they stop spending. How much, so that's a bigger trend than just the underlying thing you talked here. So how does that look as policymakers as you look at the more bifurcation of income distribution and how people spend money? How do local policymakers, fiscal policy, raise revenues based upon the sources we traditionally use, even if you take into account services?
Well, I think that point becomes even more important when you look at the bifurcation of income, right? Because the wealthy, the people with a lot of wealth, they spend a much lower portion of their income on retail, right? So this is the retail sales tax it has a much more significant burden on the people, the have-nots, than it does on the haves. And so if you rely more and more on the retail tax, you say, well, our revenue here is waning, and we look at that and say, but unfortunately at the state level, that's one of the few sources we have to tap, so let's keep increasing the rate from 4.5 to 5.5. Right now, some localities in Hampton Roads are paying 7% on retail sales. If you keep using this as your source and increasing the rate, it's a tax that has a huge burden on those without income and less of a burden on those who have a great deal of wealth because they are using a lot more of their money to spend on services. So that's a really good point.
Does this reflect online sales?
This does, yeah. So not all online sales. The state estimates right now approximately 80% of online sales are taxed, and that includes that 80%. About 20% is not taxed. That probably will be changing within the next year or two as the Supreme Court made a pretty significant decision that's going to require Washington to address in one way or another. But essentially 80% of it's taxed here if we could pull in that other 20%. So this is money that actually flows back into the localities. If we look at home prices in Hampton Roads, obviously the other huge component that is responsible for local revenues, we can see the green line here is Hampton Roads, the orange is Virginia, the black is the US, but we can see, looking at home prices, that we had a pretty significant run-up in the early part of 2000s. There was a couple of reasons that the state and the nation saw that. We saw low mortgage rates, and that put increased pressure on home prices. We also saw that anybody could gain access to a loan. So money was available for everybody everywhere. What was different about Hampton Roads is that we had housing prices that were undervalued. We saw pretty significant increases in housing allowances coming from the DOD that flowed right into our housing. And we also saw some pretty significant pay increases in DOD. So Hampton Roads was flush with money. They had undervalued houses. They had no requirements to get loans, and it was very cheap to get loans. So that really built up our housing prices. Then we saw the crash along with the nation and the Commonwealth. Since then, we've been bumbling along the bottom a little bit. This is one of the areas, again, with retail sales that we don't expect to see much growth coming in the future. And there's a couple of reasons to that. Federal tax law has changed, which is going to put downward pressure on home prices. Also, we're seeing interest rates climb, and as interest rates climb, mortgage rates climb, which makes housing less affordable, puts downward pressure on housing prices. We still have a lot of bank-owned real estate in the Hampton Roads region, more so than other markets, and that's a third thing that's really going to hold housing prices in check for Hampton Roads. So we don't expect this to see substantial growth anytime soon. Again, this is a regional indicator. So as you all are aware, some neighborhoods in Virginia Beach have seen house price declines while others have increased. You know, all housing is local, but if we look across, we do see some general trends, and one of those is that we do not expect housing prices to increase substantially. That said, we still are seeing issues creeping back up with housing affordability, and I would like to encourage our localities to always keep that in check. As this line decreases, housing becomes less affordable, and so if we look at this is a housing opportunity index. That's always one thing to keep in mind. If we're not building housing stock and we're having people that are in need of housing, then housing opportunities become less affordable.
How does this impact with stock that is older? How is that playing into, if our home values are staying stagnant or not upping as, it seems like we're pretty considerably lower to the national average. So is that because some of our housing stock is quite old? Is it because we're not encouraging residents to reinvest in their properties so that they're more competitive on the market? Is there any speculation in that?
Well, if you're asking what is it that impacts home prices, essentially the easiest way is just to think of supply and demand. So it doesn't matter the age of the housing stock, it doesn't matter the condition, right? If there's a huge demand for housing and there's limited supply, your price will increase. So that's the easiest way to think about it. Once you start looking, peeling off the layers of the onion, so to speak, one of the number one things that impacts housing prices, as most people in this room are going to be aware of, is schools. So you can have, old housing stock in great schools versus old housing stock in not so great schools, so once you look at, you almost have to look at this neighborhood by neighborhood as to what is causing one neighborhood to see increases or decreases. But the main component that it always comes back to is simply that supply and demand. I would say that housing in Hampton Roads is not really under the national average. Some areas of Hampton Roads are significantly high, especially when compared to some of the incomes. We actually have a pretty sizable share of people that pay over 30% of their income towards housing, and that's not a good thing. Housing, in that sense, we rank poor compared to other metro areas because we do not have affordable housing that way.
Very good, thank you.
Looking real quick at population, this looks to be relatively a straight line. If you go back and you remember what I was showing you about defense outlays, and we saw the Vietnam run up, and we saw the 80s war on terror, 80s Cold War buildup, that essentially correlates with the two. These blue arrows are the decades of increase in population. We saw in the 60s and the 80s, we saw some significant bumps, but after that, decade by decade, in the 90s, it was 0.8%, 0.6% the 2000s, and since 2010, it's been about 0.5% annually where we're seeing population growth in Hampton Roads. Hampton Roads is the 37th largest metro area in the U.S., and population's at 1.73 million there. If we look at a population histogram in Hampton Roads, if you remember from maybe early on in school, I don't even know when they taught us this, but essentially it's supposed to look like a triangle. It does not. If we look at this by generation, you kind of get a sense. We have the silent generation with a bit of the greatest up top. We see the expanse of the boomers, a little contraction with the Generation X, a bit of an echo boom with the millennials, and one of the interesting things that's playing out all over Hampton Roads is this next generation is relatively small compared to previous generations. If we look at graduation rates, I'll just touch a bit on education here. There's two different, the black line and the beige line are both state graduation rates. They changed the way they calculated the graduation rates to more accurately reflect what was happening. But essentially here for Hampton Roads, we're consistently below statewide graduation rate levels, which is really unfortunate. One of the things that we talk about routinely is the importance of investing in education for two reasons. One, if you do invest in education, then you reap the benefits of a better educated workforce and people who are ready to enter it and have the education that they need. And two, if you don't invest in education, then those people that you did not educate, they don't leave, they stay here. So you really want to invest in education because you have both a carrot and a stick mentality there.
Is that
Yes.
last figure correct? Because I thought we were higher than the state average.
This is Hampton Roads.
We're all freaking out higher than the state.
Yes, in Virginia Beach, we are higher than the state.
Yeah.
We were just like, wait a minute.
So all of these things are regional, and I think it's also important to remember, right? While Virginia Beach's rates are above statewide levels, when you start looking into the labor force makes this all flow together, and I'll touch on a little bit more of that later. So, I would encourage Virginia Beach not just to be higher than the state level, but to be highest in the state. And once they get highest in the state, then we go beyond that. I'm always reaching for that golden bar. But if we look at per pupil spending in Hampton Roads, again, these are regional numbers, not Virginia Beach specific numbers, but we can see that per pupil spending has been below the Commonwealth average for quite some time. If we look at education,
Go back for a second, because obviously Virginia Beach spends less than Norfolk. Obviously, you can look at the results, and the school systems have two different aggregate results. I don't understand what insight this provides policymakers, because there's no relationship between spending and outcome. So what are we trying to communicate with this graph?
well, first of all, I would disagree with you that there's no relation between spending and outcome. The problem that I think is that when people see spending and outcome, and I'll just use York County as a great example. So York County does not spend a great deal on education, and they have fantastic outcomes, right? The difference is we understand that certain populations require a lot more intensity in terms of the amount of resources that are devoted to those populations to maintain educational outcomes. if you do, this is one of an interesting study, and I'll have to find it for you because I think you'll enjoy it. I think it comes out of Yale University, but they're saying education is one of those few things that actually, if you do throw money at it, you do see benefits. So if you were to take the same cohort and increase the level of investment within the cohort, you will see an increase in benefit in that cohort. For example, if you take one school and you say, we're going to invest more resources within this one school, do we see better outcomes? Yes, we do. That is different to say than, can we compare York County to Newport News, to Hampton, to Virginia Beach? Because that's really an apples and oranges comparison. But once you control for all the other variables and say, does increased investments in education yield better outcomes? Yes, they do within the cohort.
But then that confirms that this per pupil spending on a regional basis doesn't convey any of that differentiation, and you can draw no analytical conclusions from it.
That would be true. I would, however, say that if we have not seen graduation rates that are currently at the Commonwealth level, and we consistently underfund per pupil education, one of the ways that we can raise the bar is to make education more of a priority and invest more in education so that we could see increase in graduation rates. Because if each cohort has an increased level of investment, then we would raise the bar. And that has been borne out in the research, but you do call in question a good point. It is right to kind of take it down and understand it in that way. If we look at education here, and then this is another interesting statistic, we look at high school equivalence, and Hampton Roads looks rather good. 91.5% of people above 25 in Hampton Roads have high school equivalence compared to 88% in the U.S. average. The unfortunate component here is we're not necessarily graduating these kids, we're importing them through the Department of Defense, military. If we use the number of people that are 18 years old, we don't look so good. So while some of these education statistics make us look good or bad, it's really important to understand the dynamics. With respect to college attainment and graduate professional degree, we're pretty consistent with the national average.
Does that take into the college or the professional degree, does that take into account trade school, or is that?
Professional would be a master's and above.
Okay, that's what I thought, I just wanted to clarify.
If we look at government finances real quick, on a per capita basis, Hampton Roads localities invest more in government finances than does the Commonwealth as a whole. If we look at where we spend those monies, Public Works in Hampton Roads is significantly higher than statewide averages. Ours Parks and Rec, Judicial Administration, Public Safety, significantly above state averages. Again, on the lower end there, you see education, health, and welfare. Those are two areas where Hampton Roads spends less per capita than statewide averages. I talked a little bit about quality of life earlier. Quality of life in Hampton Roads is fantastic. That's probably why a lot of us live here. Violent crime is 86% of the national average. Poverty rate, 87% of the national average. And even if we look at the environment, our ozone levels are 89% of the national attainment levels, which is good. This is just something real quick. We put together a benchmarking study each year. We compare ourselves to these other regions between 1 and 4 million in a couple of areas. And if we compare, we can look at percent of people in the armed forces. Hampton Roads is first when we compare to those other metropolitan areas. Percent of people worked outside the county of residence. This is very interesting. We rank third. Almost half of the people in Hampton Roads, when they get up to go to work in the morning, they leave their jurisdiction and work somewhere else. If we look at the percent of the population that moved in the past year, we're a very transient community. We rank fourth highest. Per capita income, as I mentioned, we're pretty much in the middle, as are we with respect to a bachelor's degree. Median age, this might strike many as a surprise, but we're a relatively young metropolitan region. And then again, this measure of income disparity between the haves and the have-nots, we rank 35th, which is good. We have less disparity between the haves and have-nots than many other metropolitan areas. I'll just touch very quickly on Virginia Beach. I think you're very familiar with this data. But this is a Virginia Beach population histogram. You can see it differs a little bit than that from Hampton Roads, but you can also see in the 5 to 20 years, it looks like it's wearing a belt essentially, but you have the baby boomers and the echo boom, and we have a little bit of kind of an interesting look at how population will play out in Hampton Roads and Virginia Beach specifically. If we look at Virginia Beach population growth, this is, I think, a very interesting graph because there was significant growth from the 60s all the way up through the 90s. We saw substantial population growth and turned Virginia Beach into the largest city in the Commonwealth in 450,000 in 2017. Here's population growth rate. So this red dashed line is Virginia Beach. The green line is Hampton Roads, the orange is Virginia, and the black is the United States. And as you see the U.S. right there, they average about 1% growth rate. And since they've been relatively consistent, locality growth rates are always much more variable than nationwide one. But you can see how the growth rate in Virginia Beach has kind of come to be one of more of a mature city as it's passed over time. We look at industry employment in Virginia Beach, accommodation and food. By far hold the largest share: retail, trade, healthcare, education services. You can kind of see how things break down. On the bottom there, I'll just note agriculture, forestry, and fishing. Very little employment. If we look at the 10-year change, the agriculture, forestry, and fishing has seen substantial growth, but seeing how it's a very tiny part of industry employment in Virginia Beach, it's not that significant. On the bottom end, we can see we've lost some construction, wholesale trade, information, but on the top end, we've grown with accommodation and food, healthcare, and public administration here. Again, comparing Virginia Beach to Hampton Roads, Virginia, and the U.S., I hope that you can see this. But essentially, the light green blocks mean that Virginia Beach records the lowest number, and the blue box means that Virginia Beach has the highest number. With respect to unemployment, Virginia Beach has a lower unemployment rate than the other reference areas. The percentage of people that are not in the labor force, Virginia Beach has, again, the lowest 10-year employment growth rate. Virginia Beach is in the middle at 2.7% compared with the U.S. at 6.5% and Virginia at 4.8%. 10-year population growth, Virginia Beach compares lower than Hampton Roads and the other areas. Median household income, Virginia Beach is substantially above state and national averages. Owner-occupied housing rate, we're in the middle at Virginia Beach at 65%. Average family size, we have smaller family size at Virginia Beach than other areas, and median age, Virginia Beach is right in the middle. Looking real quickly to the future, one of the things that just came up in conversation earlier today is as we're looking to the future and we're seeing what's happening with stock market, when is the next recession? I don't know. Nobody does. But if we look at this, we're 9.5 years between recessions right now since World War II. The average has been 58 months, so just short of 5 years. So we're at almost double the average length between recessions since World War II, and we're approaching the previous longest time between recessions. This is the forecast for U.S. gross domestic product. One of the things that's really interesting here, I put this chart up for some time, going back quite a few years now. One of the things that we have not seen is just a consistent agreement and a declining trend with respect to what the expectations are for the future with respect to U.S. gross product. We did bump up a little bit there. You can see we've got over 4%. We spiked the economy. We took tax cuts and we threw them into the economy. We cut revenues, and so people have more money. And not only did we do that, we really pushed out expenditures. So in the federal government, cut revenues and boosted expenditures. It really primed the economy. And you know, short term, that's great. You take your credit card out and you go spend on a spending spree. It feels good at the time, but at some point you got to pay the piper, and that's what that consensus forecast is pointing towards. One of the things that we've seen significantly is that the projected increases in federal budget deficits are growing. So this is just deficits. This is going to be, we're approaching $1 trillion a year. This is from the Congressional Budget Office, which some would say is kind of a rosy forecast. Doesn't look so rosy from here. but each of these deficits impacts the national debt further and further, and the fastest growing part of the federal government federal budget is going to be interest on the debt. So that's one of the things to look forward to. The reason I say this is because right now we're in a situation where we're seeing Department of Defense is putting substantial money into the nation, but especially into Hampton Roads. So we have a year, 18 months, maybe 24 months of a lot of federal expenditures coming in. We saw the largest increase in a decade, I think it was a decade, for DOD employment in terms of raises. We're seeing a lot of expenditures in infrastructure in Hampton Roads, which is fantastic. And all these things that we really want to see in Hampton Roads, with the DOD being such an integral part of the economy, we're seeing huge investments in Hampton Roads. We're seeing money coming in. But at some point, we have to deal with this again. And since 50% of discretionary expenditures are DOD related, in order to cut your discretionary expenditures, you're going to have to address this DOD thing. And that's why when I look into the next year or two and I say things are going to be good for Hampton Roads this next year, 2019 is looking good, 2020 is looking good. I don't want people to think like, yay, happy times are here again, because 2021 and 2022 are going to be coming, and we need to be ready for that. I talked a little bit about how half the people in Hampton Roads get up in the morning and they leave their jurisdiction to go somewhere else. We call this a spaghetti graph. So if you can follow all these lines, this is the number of people that are changing jurisdictions and going somewhere else. This is Virginia Beach specific. So essentially 25% of the people that are working in Virginia Beach every day come from other jurisdictions, and 40% of the workers in Virginia Beach work in a different locality. So when we're looking at things such as income, employment, and all that stuff, it's incredibly important to remember, Virginia Beach is its own jurisdiction, but it's part of a region, and the regional interaction that happens in Hampton Roads is really, really high compared to these other metro areas. So when we're comparing ourselves to a Seattle or a San Diego or Indianapolis, we're a very different animal. We have many jurisdictions all required in a sense to work together, and that just kind of goes to show that. That completes my comments.
Two questions before you go. You talked briefly about SALT. That's the state and local tax limitations of the federal tax code, which will raise almost all upper income people's taxes, both to the feds and to the state. And have you modeled that and looked to see what impact that's going to have on the discretionary consumer economies because of SALT? That's one aspect of the SALT has. And the other one is where the state decides to spend the revenues. That's another, not for you, but and then lastly, you didn't talk about the implications of the deficits on the forecast 10-year Treasury note, which is kind of like the foundation for public sector borrowing. So that's another demand signal that influences the cost of borrowing for local governments and the impact that has. Do you have any insights as to what you see relative to those 2 points?
So I can't say much with respect to 10 years. That's really not my area of expertise. All I can tell you is, the literature that I've read on that, as you expect, they're going up. It's really difficult to determine exactly what's going to happen because so much can change from one year to the next, the federal government. And so anybody who's trying to forecast what the expectations are with considering policy changes that are likely to happen, especially with respect to long-term interest rates, it's clear everybody's pointing that they're going up, but it's unclear exactly what, because the unknowns are so substantial and so significant that you can't forecast it. Just combining real quick, SALT with the tax changes at the state level, and for clarification, with the current administration changed the taxes at the national level. Typically what happens in Virginia is we follow suit, and when the federal tax changes are made, we're a conformity state, so we conform. Right now there's substantial incentive for the state not to conform because there's going to be an increase in statewide revenues. And the revenues that they're going to derive is not because they're just taking federal money and giving it to the state. It means that essentially taxpayers are going to be paying more because a real simple way to say it, if you used to itemize at the federal level and now you don't, then you can no longer itemize at the state level, and that's going to increase. That's going to probably be 70% of the increase that the state's going to see. So the state has a boon, probably. I don't think they have enough time to hold a special session before the end of the year to change it. So it's likely that they're going to see a boon next year with respect to revenues. What they use that money for, hopefully it's education or something along those lines. But what they use that money for is probably, well, I can't put any speculation into that, but I would imagine that this is probably going to be a one-year thing, because people are suddenly going to realize, oh my gosh, I paid a lot more taxes this year than I did the year before, and the state can go, whoopsie, we'll fix that. But in the meantime, they got a little bit of revenue. We would love to see some comprehensive tax reform so that we can deal with the issues such as the retail sales tax, which needs to be adjusted. But moving forward, I think it would be wrong for people to think that the state's not going to conform at some point. They're going to need to do that. How we do it, hopefully, will involve some measure of comprehensive tax reform.
Thank you, Greg. Appreciate that. Okay, Farrell, thank you.
Thank you, Greg. I'd rather get a root canal than follow Greg. I'm sorry. We don't have a whole lot of time, and I want to make sure David has an opportunity to present. So I'm going to make a few introductory comments. I'm going to move through just the several slides I have very quickly. Here in Virginia Beach, Virginia Beach City Public Schools, we are safer, more equitable, and higher achieving than ever. Across the board, we've seen monumental gains in graduation rates, advanced placement courses, the number of career certifications earned by our students. We're a fully accredited school district for the second year in a row, and our grad rates are the highest on record at 93.3%. Families move to Virginia Beach for the school division, and taxpayers are proud to contribute to such high achieving system. 90% of our parents feel our schools are safe and welcoming places to learn. We're proud of the progress we've made in the Virginia Beach City Public Schools. Move through these slides very quickly. Everything that we're going to cover is covered in more detail in the full report, which everybody has an opportunity and access to. In this first slide, I'm not going to go through each of these, but basically the state sales tax increases 2.5% during the first year, and then incrementally increases over the years up to about 3% in the last, I think, 2 years. Other state revenue, primarily the basic aid for education, increases 2.5% plus the first year, plus $6.73 million, which is what the legislature approved for a 3% raise for those SOL positions for the following year, and then increases incrementally to about 3% in the last year of the forecast. Local revenues increase just slightly above 1% during the next year's first year of the forecast, and then slightly above 2% for the remaining years of the forecast. Federal revenues for the schools will remain flat. That's our prediction. The Sandbridge TIF, during the first year of the forecast, we'll take $409,000 of that and move it to the operating budget only for the first year of the forecast. And then finally, in terms of the revenue, let me go back one more. The schools have been relying on reversion funds or one-time monies over the last few years to balance the budget. It's where we've covered our shortfall each year. In the current year's budget, that's $6.8 million. During the forecast period, we're proposing to decrease that by $1 million a year until we take that to zero. Our expenditure highlights, salary increases for the first year mirrors what the state is providing funding for that 3%, and then it's 2% for the remaining period of the forecast period. Health insurance rates are projected to increase slightly below the national average, and ours forecast is 3% per year. We will continue implementation of the full-day kindergarten through the remaining portion of the forecast period. All non-personnel line items that are affected by inflation increase by 2.5% each of those years. Our capital outlay expense increases by $450,000 a year. That's to purchase replacement school buses. Some of our budgetary goals and challenges, obviously programmatic priorities. One of the newer issues that we face is the technology that we need to put in schools, and that replace broken and aging whiteboards and standalone interactive displays. Compensation for employees, competitive pay increases, and we will move into, we've completed the funding of the unified scale for school employees, those that are on that scale, and now we'll move into looking at certain allowances and extra duty supplements and things like that. Often state and federal mandates come either without no additional funds or the mandates aren't fully funded. So that's going to be an ongoing problem in future years. Trying to get this thing to work. Here we go. Also, one of the challenges is the lagging state funding. State budget allocates actually 9% less on K through 12 instruction than it did in 2005. School safety and security is becoming one of the major issues that we're facing moving forward. We're just now beginning to implement the Blue Ribbon Panels Task Force on School Safety and Security, and that will be an ongoing initiative over future years. Challenging demographics of our students. An example of that is more families are now categorized as below the poverty level. And one of the other issues that we're facing there is the school board's got to come up with strategies, working with the city council, how to fund the long-range facilities study, and the recommendations that just came out of the recent study that was presented to the school board this past summer. I'm not going to go into every slide here because I want to make sure I leave room for David, but our expenses and our revenues, each of the forecast year, there are some deficits, and you can read in the report the rationale and the reason for those. However, over the forecast period compared to other forecast periods and historically, those deficits are slightly lower than we predicted in the past. David.
Mr. Hanson, they presented here today. Some of them weren't in the part that we had, and I'm sure that's true for them too. But do I read this slide to read at this point in time, you're not asking, or not, or you can't say you would be, but do you anticipate that the school will be asking for an adjustment to the revenue sharing formula in the 2019-2020 budget?
We are just now developing our budget, and I can't speak for the school board, but I'm not
I'm just
sure.
looking at your forecasted revenues and expenses, and it seems like that's matching up, but then you only made illusionary references to deficits. Is there a place where the structural deficits or other deficits that you talked about are enumerated? Is that in some other written report?
This is a forecast. It doesn't 100% reflect what next year's proposed budget will be, Mr. Moss, but obviously, the school board has always depended, since we've had a revenue sharing formula, on those revenues that are generated by the formula, unless the school board asks for a specific increase, which they did for a full-day
The only reason
kindergarten.
why I'm asking is for the first time, thank you, Mr. Mayor, we're going to have an advance of the city manager putting together the budget. The council's going to meet and provide guidance, so the school board needs to know that. They might have to advance some of their discussions to make sure that we're aware of what they're thinking about, even if they haven't made a decision, so that we could include that in our thought process. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I want to at least go through some of the revenues that we're seeing and how they impacted the forecast. The first one being real estate. Half of our general fund revenue comes from this, so obviously a healthy housing stock is important to the general fund. If you remember, we had 5 years of declining assessments, which was unprecedented in the city, and we're projecting going into fiscal year 20, it'd be 6 years of increasing assessments. That's about $538 million, this revenue source, and we have it growing 2.7% in the forecast period. Very consistent. It's been very consistent over the last few years. Personal property, that's our second largest local revenue source, about $160 million or 14% of the general fund. I say it every year, it's the hardest one we have to predict. So right now, we're forecasting fiscal year 20, and the vast majority of this revenue will not come in until June 5th. So it's a challenge for us. We've been missing it too. You can see the actual is actually, we've been underestimating it. So we may need to be a little more aggressive looking down the road. We're always a little gun shy, so to speak, on this one just because it's hard to predict coming in that late in the year. I do want to mention these four in total. These are kind of our, what I call consumer-driven revenues. In total, they're $172 million, or 15% of our general fund. And in my mind, these are leading indicators as opposed to the real estate and personal property being lagging. In 2007, when the recession was occurring, we saw these start to dip as the recession was occurring nationally. So I'm a budget director, so I got to talk a little recession. I'm going to hit that in a future slide. But we're going to be monitoring these revenues over the next 2 or 3 years because Greg kind of alluded to that. There's a lot of chatter about a recession coming. So I should also mention with these revenue streams that all of the general sales comes to the general fund. The BPOL all comes to the general fund. There's a 2-year exemption if you're a new business locating in Virginia Beach. About 60% of the restaurant comes to the general fund and about 25% of the hotel tax. Wanted to mention telecommunications. This is one that the state took over in 2006. When they did it, all the localities had different telecommunication rates. So the state kind of took it over and said, hey, we're going to apply 5% to everybody. And the idea was for it to be revenue neutral. Well, technology has changed and different things have changed, and we've actually lost $6 million of this revenue since that was implemented, and we're projecting it to go down 2% a year going forward. This is part of City Council's legislative package to ask for revenue neutrality again. State revenue, in the scheme of things as compared to the school's budget, we don't get as much state revenue. We get just under 10%. It mainly hits human services, public works for their VDOT maintenance money, constitutional officers like the sheriff, treasurer, commissioner of revenue, and we also get what's called 599 money. The sheriffs in the counties perform the law enforcement function, so they get money through the compensation board. Since in the urban cities, the police departments do it, they provide this 599 money as a way to compensate urban areas for law enforcement. And for federal, Once again, this is only 2% of our general fund, $22 million, mainly in housing and human services. It's actually been doing pretty well, except it did take a dip in 18 in actual. So we're just looking at it going flat moving forward. So as we get into the forecast, once again, we're projecting or including a 3% salary increase right now. That's for parity with the schools. The state is proposing that for instruction and their biennial budget the second year. So just like Farrell, we're following that. 2.5% inflation. All the Federal Reserve Bank information we've been seeing, and we get this Kiplinger letter, all suggesting 2.5%. So it's a little higher than what we've been using in the past. VRS, every 2 years, the state establishes a new rate for our Virginia retirement system. We're assuming that will go up 1% every other year. 3% in healthcare costs. We've had some good design changes and some incentives. Seems to be doing well. We want to touch on city operating budget and CIP. The CIP does have a big impact on the operating budget. For example, the Burton Station Fire Station is going to be opening soon. So we're going to have 30 firefighters and 12 paramedics that will be phased in over a couple-year period. So those things have a big impact, the police body camera program and things like that. And then debt, we estimate what CIP expenditures are and what the authorized but unissued debt is for the city, and we're making projections accordingly. I did want to mention budgeting for attrition, because I think this will be a discussion as we move forward in the budget process. Virginia Beach has historically, just to make sure what I mean when I say budget for attrition, we have not done that. We budget full salaries in the city. So a firefighter is budgeted from July 1st to June 30th, regardless of the fact that there may be turnover or they may retire, and there'll be a lag between hiring. If you ask me as the budget director, do we budget for attrition? I would say yes, but in arrears, because one of the things that I have to make sure we do is that we have enough cash in the CIP. And there's two sources of cash, pay-go or fund balance. And the reason why I got to make sure there's enough cash in the CIP, there are certain things in the capital improvement program we cannot bond fund. You're not going to take a 5-year loan out on a car that's going to last 3 years, where you're not going to pay 20 years of debt on sand replenishment or dredging or information technology projects. So one of the things I've always used is when at the end of the year, we have a fund balance policy of 8 to 12% of the following year's revenue. I try to be at that 10% level, and then we use whatever cash we have to put into the CIP. And we do an analysis every year to make sure we have that right cash bond balance. But in 19, when we adopted the budget, we did use attrition. We used $2.3 million to offset the cigarette and automobile license. We used $3 million for horizontal and vertical compression. So the city manager's not made a decision on this. We're going to look at it as we move into the budget process. We did a survey, a little survey. It's in the report. We looked at all the AAA bond-rated cities we compare ourselves to, area cities. About 2/3 budget for attrition, about 1/3 don't. So, we're going to look at it. If we do look at it, we want to make sure what the impact will be on the CIP, that issue I was talking about earlier. When you don't budget for attrition, it does give you some flexibility in economic downturns. You can freeze salaries and positions. And of course, we want to look at our AAA bond rating. So with all that together, here's our projection of the general fund. We're showing a $9.2 million deficit in fiscal year 20, but I want to explain that because I know, boy, that's concerning. The last 2 years we were showing basically zero. The difference in that 9.2 is almost made up of two things. One is going from a 2% pay increase to a 3%. That's $4 million. Every 1% in the general fund is roughly $4 million. And then that $5.3 million that I talked about on the attrition slide before, we're still, for the purposes of comparison at this stage, we're doing it the same way we did in the past. We're showing the salaries fully loaded without any attrition. Those two things are making up that $9.2 million deficit. So this would be very similar to previous year's forecast, aside from those two issues. If you look going forward, some of the things that are driving the deficit going forward, we talked about the Burton Station positions. Inflation's higher than what we've been showing in the past. We had that VRS rate going up every other year. And we actually have PAYGO going up a little bit in the out years, and all this is in the report, to maintain that kind of cash bond balance. We're always looking 5, 6 years in advance. So just in closing, I want to mention just a couple of things. You know, obviously we get our revenue from our taxpayers, and one of the challenges, and I think Greg was hitting on this, if you look at median household income since the recession, it has gone up, the green line, nominally over time, but when you adjust for inflation, it's basically been static. But that same issue has also hit our operating budget as well. If you look, our operating budget has grown, I'm sorry, it looks like my numbers have kind of creeped over to the right, but our operating budget has grown $275 million, but if you adjust for inflation, it's actually gone down by about $30 million. And in that period, we've opened an animal care shelter, numerous fire stations, you know, we've done the joint library, so there's been a lot of significant investment as well. When you compare those two over time and just look at the growth rates, you can see they're very similar. When you compare median household growth to operating budget growth, matter of fact, median household income growth in this period is slightly higher. So another way to look at, you know, our city, we want to compare to the region. We compare, look at tax burden, very hard to do. Some cities might have a waste management fee, some don't. But here's one way we look at it, comparing per capita expenditures to per capita income. We're the lowest in the region. So as I said, as a budget director, I feel obligated to at least do this. I won't go through the slide, but I felt obligated to have a messy one because Greg had one, his spaghetti. But the bottom line, we're in a sustained period of economic growth. And we found a Wall Street Journal article that surveyed economists. 58% said there'd be a recession in calendar year 2020. Well, that will be half of the fiscal year that we're going to be planning for in this next budget cycle. Greg and HRPDC puts together an economic forum, and we had that a week or two ago. And the big debate among two of the economists is whether it would be 2020 or 2021. So there's a lot more chatter about a recession than I've seen in the past. Greg had that forecast that he showed. And that's why I wanted to mention that consumer revenue slide that I showed earlier. Remember sales and all that? We're going to monitor this. We're going to be looking for it, and we want to be ahead of it if something like that does occur. So just in closing, I think Greg mentioned this, the regional economy is improving. We're still lagging behind some of the other MSAs. The budget process, both for schools, I think Mr. Moss was asking this, and for city, we will close that deficit. We're showing you a forecast today, but when we present that budget in March, there will not be a deficit. We have to make future decisions on compensation and budgeting for attrition. I mentioned the recession. We want to keep our eye on that. We did not include enterprise funds in this discussion. The city manager is scheduling enterprise fund discussions for the city council in February and March, and we'll go in detail of the waste management fund, stormwater fund, and water and sewer fund. And Mayor, with that, that's our end of our presentation.
Yeah, question.
Later date, can we get the slides we've got in the past, which shows the two debt policy indicators and shows the policy that's been issued and the policy and the debt that's programmed to be issued relative to the maximum under our policy? We used to get a chart like that. Can we get that again?
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Okay, anybody else? I know we went a little over, but this was important information that we got out today, and I think it underscores the need for further discussion and collaboration. And with that, actually,
Mayor Dyer, I just want to say I am the one person around the table who knows conclusively that she will not be returning in January, and how much I've truly enjoyed working with the city council and the school board, and it's been an honor, and thanks for everybody.
and Ashley, thank you for your years of commitment and service. And for
Didn't
this
ask for
week,
that as
thank
well.
you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. And at that, let's adjourn. Thank you very much, folks.